So, welcome everyone to this week's BlockScience Governance Research Pod call. We are very honoured to have Amber Case sharing. She is the head of CALM Technologies. She's one of the research directors at MetaGov. She's involved in Superset as one of the trustees of the Data DAO, as well as having a very extensive history doing all kinds of interesting things in public interest technology. So with that, Case, I'll hand over to you and please introduce us to today's topic.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Well, that was a great introduction. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that I found by Mark Weiser, who's one of my favorite people, at Xerox PARC in the mid-90s. And I'm going to read it to you, at least the more interesting parts, because I think it's a fun thing to do to kind of read along and get the information at the same time together. So this paper was written about the technologist's responsibilities in social change. What do we do as technologists when we build dangerous technologies, or how to tell if something's dangerous or not? And it gives, I think notably, this paper is very well formatted for a number of reasons. First, it doesn't try to sound smart. It doesn't try to say that you need to have X amount of information in order to understand this. It's written very plainly about a very complicated and difficult perennial topic, which is what do we do with dangerous technologies? And then it offers some ideas. And then at the end, it philosophizes a little bit. I'm really interested in the first part of the paper and not necessarily the philosophizing. And we'll dig into why, perhaps from my perspective on that. And then we'll go from there. So this paper came out in '95, and I'll just start here, and you can read along. I have it on paper because I like paper. It's a little bit cooler of a media. So it starts. I'm honored to offer a few words of commentary on these older columns by David Porosh and Stephen Doheny-Farina. First, let me explain a little about Ubiquitous Computing, or UbiComp, a technology I helped develop and one they mention concern about in their columns. I weigh in as an engineer, someone whose primary interest is in what should I build next. Ubiquitous Computing is an unusual project for an engineer for two reasons. First, because I took inspiration from anthropology, and second, I knew that whatever we did could be wrong. The anthropological critique was common in some quarters of Xerox PARC when I arrived in 1987. It went approximately like this. The most profound technologies are those that become embedded in people's lives. Current computers force people to separate their machine life from the rest of their lives. So computers, in their current form, would never become a very significant or profound technology. Now, where Doheny-Farina might have breathed a sigh of relief, I took this as a challenge. Could I design a radically new kind of computer that could more deeply participate in the world of people? This led me quickly to the second conclusion, that I would get it wrong. As I began to glimpse what such an information appliance might look like, I saw it would be so different from today's computer that I could not begin to understand or build it. So I set out instead to build some things that my colleagues and I could put in use, things as different as we could imagine from today's computers, yet using technology that could be made solid today. Using these things would then change us. From that new perspective, I would then try to glimpse our new kind of computer and try again. Thus, PARC launched projects to build inch, foot, and yard size computers, or the tabs, pads, and boards of Ubiquitous Computing Phase 1. Arguably, we have pads, tabs, and boards today. Interestingly, the active badges that track location that have Doheny-Farina so concerned were not invented at PARC at all, but at Olivetti and Digital Equipment Corporation. However, we gladly use them as a way to help our machines know more about us, so they could better serve us. And thus we found ourselves in the middle of a controversy. Before we go into the controversy, I need to explain these active badges. So Olivetti was a typewriter company, and they made these badges that would track you inside of a company. And so at Xerox PARC, you'd have these big boards up on the wall, and you could see where everybody in Xerox PARC was. And so if something really interesting was going on, you didn't see where anyone was, you could look at the board, see everyone clustered around somebody's computing unit, and then you'd go on your kind of little social network to discover what everybody was excited about. Because you could tell where everyone was, there was this heightened sense of ambient awareness. But the issue is that when you take that to global scale and everyone has a phone with GPS on them, someone knows where everyone is, and it's not necessarily each other, it's somebody else. And so this is part of this controversy is, you know, once everybody has active badges, what happens? So before long, comments in the press and from our colleagues indicated we were doing something dangerous, a technology that could be used for tracking and control of people. What if Nazi Germany had this? But we also believe that we are creating a technology with significant potential for good. The excesses of those proposing that we all don goggles to live in virtual reality on one hand, and those proposing that cute little computer personalities would be at our beck and call, e.g. Microsoft, on the other, seemed to push our program forward like a melon seed squeezed between two absurd fingers. What to do? One possibility was to stop all work immediately. All such work immediately. Since we could see the potential for evil applications, why do it? And some individuals in the lab took this road. Others, including myself, continued the debate. Could we at PARC bring some special value to the work that others might not? Well, at PARC, we have philosophers, social scientists, and anthropologists to offset the engineers. Perhaps we could proceed with the work while maintaining a dialogue about its uses. This would at least be an improvement over the naive optimism of a pure engineering lab. For instance, Olivetti Research is comfortable broadcasting the locations of all of its employees to anyone on the internet. Gradually, we evolved a two-part guide to action for ubiquitous computer research. These two parts might be useful to others working on technologies that evoke the suspicion of people like Doheny Farina. And then here are the Weiser principles for inventing socially dangerous technology. I need a little bit more caffeine. First, build it as safe as you can and build into it all of the safeguards to personal values that you can imagine. And two, tell the world at large that you are doing something dangerous. Principle one ensures that as an engineer, a trained engineer, not someone who just messed around with some code on Stack Overflow, a trained engineer, you have demonstrated to all concerned that it is possible to construct your system with appropriate safeguards. Unfortunately, it is rarely possible to build them in such a way that they cannot be removed. And so, as Doheny Farina clearly questions, what prevents organizations less enlightened than PARC from removing those safeguards? And principle two comes to the rescue by then providing a basis for informed discussion and action by anybody. Most engineers will defend as strongly as possible the value of their work and leave it to others to find fault. But that is not enough if one is doing something that one knows has possibly dangerous consequences. The responsible engineer in this case must proactively begin debate about how the technology should be used. For one thing, he or she may learn of more things to be applied under principle one. And for another, informed people are less likely to let safeguards be removed. In practice, as we learned, principle two sometimes becomes principle 2A. Cooperate with overblown and distorted media stories about your work. I have heard NBC Nightly News describe Xerox PARC as being at the forefront of Big Brother technology, as though the world were sprinkled with surveillance laboratories, but we happen to be the best. And so that leads to principle 2B. Better that people are too scared about what you are doing than they not find out until it's too late, as we write and say in computer biz, sigh. Principle 2 is far from a guarantee that evil will not be done, but I know of no way to provide such a guarantee for any technology. Refusing to work on such technology is the approach of the ostrich. However, I am an optimist. I think that people will eventually figure out how to use technology for the benefit, including, if necessary, passing laws or establishing social conventions to avoid its worst dangers. It should be every engineer's role to provide as much information as possible in the debate leading to these new laws and conventions. Let me take a moment to respond to some of the specific commentary of Doheny Farina. Interestingly, he appears to be extremely optimistic about both technology and human nature. For instance, Doheny Farina says at one point, "As I read, As I read on, I expected to be assured that any Orwellian nightmares would be unjustified because of the way new technology is being designed. In other words, he expected technology to dissolve his nightmare. Now that is putting power into the hands of engineers, but it is power we should not have and fortunately do not have. Doheny Farina's expectation amounts in essence to the expectation that technology should contain inherent values. One culture's Orwellian nightmare might be another's answered prayers. A technology which could, on the basis of technology alone, prevent the one would also prevent the other. I don't believe there can ever be any such technology. A law of physics or of morality. Yes, safeguards can be built into any system, such as checks and balances in a good accounting system, but what keeps them in place is not the technology, but people's commitment to keeping them. We cannot expect technology alone to solve ethical dilemmas. Technology is a tool made by people to meet people's needs. Like all tools, it can be used in ways undreamed of by the inventor. Like all tools, it will change the user in unexpected and profound ways. Doheny Farina makes much use of my word dissent to describe those in my lab who felt Ubicomp might be wrong. I think dissent is a good word. It does not imply that the dissenter is wrong. In fact, quite often in Western history, the dissenter is proven right. In the creation and application of new technology, there will always be disagreement about what to do. As Freud says very well, technology cannot be turned on and off or simply ignored by those who choose to ignore it. Doheny Farina is quite the optimist if he thinks it will ever be easy for people to do what is right instead of what is popular. It takes courage and intelligence to oppose technology when necessary. It is vital, I believe, to have a tradition of honorable dissent, of supporting those who cry no when everyone else is swept along. No set of principles can take the place of engaging in discussion, pulling, pushing, and throwing one's weight into composing the life and culture we will lead in the future. Engineers like myself are just part of the dialogue, perhaps the smallest part, although one overemphasized in the late 20th century counter-revolution against the death of modernism. The main discussion is the one that happens day to day among all the individuals of our culture as they choose to go along or dissent. Thank you everyone for letting me participate in this one. So that is the paper here. And it'd be fun to discuss the paper before we perhaps discuss how block science or some of the principles in block science might be very similar to this, and do a kind of compare contrast. I have a lot of running commentary and notes in my notebook here, but I'd love to hear maybe a little bit of feedback on what did you think of this perspective and what thoughts you guys have before we move along.
The thing that struck me is the sort of the parallels. I'm not sure when sort of the ethical regulator idea crept up, but I think it's after this. But it brings along a lot of those points. It seems that a lot of what Weiser is saying is that the ethical regulation of something isn't the thing itself. It's governance of that thing. And I think that for an engineer to accept that is an interesting thing, and I think it points to his sort of being driven from a more social science perspective than say a hard science perspective.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. I really like a bunch of little pieces in here. When I first read this, when I was writing my thesis on mobile phones in 2007, was the idea that instead of an engineering only organization, there were the ideas of breaking down problems that people faced and also having the social scientists and historians and all of these different people to more faithfully represent the population. Because I think one of the issues that I've seen, especially in VR and AR, is you have an organization of mostly engineers and sometimes some artists, very rarely who are building things with the idea that they should be built because it showed up in Popular Science magazine, not to fundamentally solve a problem. Like, they spend less time looking at the problem that they're trying to solve, and then they build in this kind of alternate universe over here, and they don't actually have, they're not necessarily building for people or understanding what people need or want, because they don't have more of a representation of the population. Like when he talks about in here that the technology is built by people for people, we don't necessarily think the kind of people that are building the technology. This goes hand in hand with this old story from Xerox PARC, that the Xerox copy machines, when they came out early, were super noisy and really difficult to use, because the engineers assumed that everybody wanted to be able to push every single button and have complete control over the system and change everything up. And so they put all these buttons about everything you could do with the machine on the machine. And you would have to have these, you'd have to train like a full-time woman to operate the machine. It would be in a corner, and these would be the printers. And then when Lucy Suchman, an anthropologist, showed up, the story goes that she figured out that people just wanted to press a copy and a print button. And so to make these colorful button shapes on the machine would allow you to have the best of both worlds. If you were an engineer and you wanted to press any of the buttons and modify anything, you could do that. But if you just wanted to use it as a regular human being without, full-time training associated with it, you could also just press the print and the copy button and make some settings. And you could hang out with the machine alongside it, versus it being, this thing cast off into a cave to the side. So this was this whole idea of, it wasn't an engineer that solved that problem. It was an anthropologist understanding how people used it, and the assumption that everybody had the mind of the engineer that built it would be using it was not correct. And so if we go through how so many people are building things right now, and a lot of the instances in which things aren't being built in a real way, or there's these hype cycles, a lot of people might be building things from some sort of distorted engineering perspective without understanding how people actually need to use it, or the idea that they're building things that people don't necessarily want, but they're not hanging out with enough people that aren't like them to understand that. So when I learned about BlockScience and that there are social scientists and lots of different kinds of people, it made me very excited, because it isn't just a place where people are talking about building one specific thing. And I think even up the chain, if we talk about a lot of the early breakthroughs in some of the more interesting spaces, thinking about Claude Shannon, there's a little report by Claude Shannon. It's, how do you get the noise out of a telephone line? Very specific problems that are facing the world at scale at Bell Labs. It wasn't, let's build something cool together. It was, what is this problem? It was more like, what is this problem? Then you're given a lot of leeway to think about different ways to solve the problem. And in solving that problem, coming up with much larger and more interesting innovations. So it seems like maybe two things that I'm seeing in the world. One, we're not getting those well-defined problems as much. And second, we're not necessarily even remembering that we can think that way. There's an essay that I wrote about truth and truthiness, where there's the idea of something that is the truth, and it might be very boring, like using Google search versus what a movie would tell you to do for search, which is like surf through cyberspace, which is three-dimensional, have a bunch of techno music going on. And in reality, what people use every day is actually this boring pass-through interface. And so how much of what people are building right now is based on this truthiness? It looks like the truth, it looks like the media. And then how many people are kind of saying, well, it's really hard to be counter, to be a dissenter, as is stated in this essay, and to work on the stuff that actually needs to be built, when everybody's saying, no, we don't need that, we need this other thing, because we were told by popular mechanics we need that thing. And the kind of siren call right now, especially of VC, is not necessarily about innovation, but is about making stuff that makes money for a glorified fund manager in 3 to 5 years, ideally. It's not necessarily about making something long-term, or fundamentally changing, or fundamentally solving a specific problem. So, so yeah, thanks for your commentary, David.
I put my hand up. Can I go next? Is that a yes? Cool. I never do that, so I'm trying to be polite. Yeah, that was so interesting. Thank you for dictating it. I think it's actually quite powerful, and it's really helpful to get everyone on the same page with the content, in case I didn't have time to kind of pre-read. The question that came up for me is, what are your thoughts on the actual processes to embed these kind of principles? Like it's, the principles are like articulate the dangers, like communicate the dangers broadly, and so on. But what is the actual process, or what are the kind of processes, or what processes have you heard of to actually ensure that is done as part of the engineering life cycle? And I guess this context is in the question of broader framing of work that's like very live for me. And I don't know what it's called yet. I don't really have a name, but it's something, it's like embedded ethics is out there, and it's like similar to that, but not quite that. And I'm thinking about technologies that are kind of pre-regulation, like blockchain and AI, although blockchain is regulated in many ways. And so like when something is ambiguous and like pre-regulation, like how do you embed, positive societal values, depending on who that constituency is, in the actual processes of its development?
That's a really good question. I think one of the ideas that I keep thinking of is, sorry, I'm waiting for some noise to die down. There's the idea of just looking at it from a civil engineering perspective. Like, Zargham has this book that he likes people to read, like Designing a Safer World. And I think this is a great book because it talks about how at least many civil engineers might be taught, where it's not necessarily, and now here's our chapter on ethics. It's ethics and the idea that when you are building a bridge, you're not building a bridge to make a 10x multiple for a VC. You're building a bridge because people need to go across the bridge. You need to have your payload, you need to have your temperature, you need to have your weather, you need to have your reasonable amount of wind that the bridge can sustain, and then you need to mark on the bridge your weight capacity. And you need to make sure that this exists for 30 to 40 years, and you need to simulate it, test it, make a model. All of these things have been done for civil engineering and the traditional engineering process for physical objects or airplanes. And it's not, and now we'll tack on ethics, or we're having ethics, like it's just in it. It's just part of it. It isn't this separate thing. And I think that's a really, really important notion, because it's not about, when we talk about ethics and technology, it's almost like some people are like, okay, well, if we have enough extra money, we'll have an ethics department. And if we don't, then we just have to not have ethics. It's like, wait, excuse me. Well, if the point is, I think the main reason why we don't have ethics, or at least engineering redundancy principles that have carried over from physical to digital, for lack of a better word, is because when people die on a bridge after it crashes, it's either made into a cool video that you can see in physics class, where everybody can see very measurably why it fails and why you should make a better bridge. And it's very inhospitable to you as a civil engineer or your civil engineering firm if it breaks. But that when people die on a bridge failure, there's actual death. You can see it, you can feel it, you can experience it, and anybody could have that happen to them. Whereas with software, when someone subscribes to, a gay and lesbian group in 2005 on Facebook, and Facebook decides to publish that to their profile, and their conservative Christian group sees that, and they have to leave town, which has happened a bunch of times in Facebook's history, in different permutations, that is a very different thing. It's not as sharp. It's not like the FDA. It's not like, the food poisoning scandal that led to like child-proof lids and like those little bumpy things that show up when you open a container. So in a way, it's softer. It's more invisible. And, if you are doing electricity in a house and electricity, kills someone, like there are regulations about when you open up that wall. And so I think in the past we might have been able to have this, and I wouldn't call it ethics because, it's got to be called something else, right? Because again, people love the idea of tacking on ethics or accessibility versus like, this is just the engineering process. And if you want to call yourself a software engineer, you need to do these things, right? Like this is the process. Do you want to make stuff that works? And so, the FDA and a couple of these other programs came out mostly around food to be like, hey, we have a society in which things aren't as regulated as we'd like them to be. So we're going to make, either standards or awards or anything that changes the incentive models from just making money to doing something that would reward them socially if they did a good job. Orion had a really good comment up here. Feels also like a problem with how production and consumption are organized, where at Xerox you had philosophers, artists, and others participating in the production of computing artifacts. The norm is now that an engineering-heavy, profit-oriented org produces those artifacts, and the philosophers and artists consume them without a strong feedback loop between the two. I completely agree. And it's really hard for a traditional engineering-heavy organization to say, we're going to have these artists and philosophers in there. Like, there's a little bit at Google, right? We're going to have your digital philosopher type, and we're going to have the fellows. They're not in the place. And the other thing is, making a Xerox PARC is not necessarily, we have to remember that both Bell Labs and Xerox PARC were almost monopolies in their field, and they had enough extra money, and that these, Bell Labs made enough money, but Xerox PARC didn't necessarily make a lot of money. But again, it wasn't about a bunch of engineers and artists and philosophers sitting in beanbag chairs with Alan Kay hanging out with them. It was, here are some problems we need to solve. And through collectively thinking about those problems from different perspectives, the interesting innovations happen. So I think that the other part is really about, how do you define a problem that people experience? And then how do you define that it's a real actual problem, not a popular science problem? And so, it's like, well, is the problem, why hasn't AR been adopted? Or is the problem, is AR necessary at any point in life on a daily basis? When we start to ask these kind of questions, which are more philosophical and anthropological questions, that's when we can get a scope of possibly the engineering things that could be solved, versus saying, I am the CEO of a company and I read that this is going to be cool. And we keep reading these things. Everyone in 2015 will be wearing heads-up displays. I'm sorry, we don't have enough rare minerals to even make the amount of chips needed for that. Not to mention that to cool something that close to your head is going to be very expensive when we're competing with wet bulb climate conditions and the need to like cool down, the environment, right? So it's like, so we have to really think about these things in a real way. So I think, one part is disentangling science fiction and fake futurism to what are the mundane pass-through technologies in our lives, like the light switch and the foot pedal and like the car, that have had to be designed with safety in mind because they will kill you if not. And how can we look at that when we design our own systems? Oh yeah, and the vertigo issues of wearing a heads-up display. It's almost like your own mind is a 3D simulator that's really good, and it operates when you read a two-dimensional book. So, it operates even better when you do that. And I think that was one of the faults of sci-fi. When you read Snow Crash or any of this cyberpunk sci-fi, when you read about someone having a heads-up display in sci-fi, you imagine it working perfectly because your mind can do that. But when you actually take that out and make that a thing, it doesn't actually necessarily need 3D. It can have two dimensions, but when do you really need it? Do you need it in the military? Do you need it when you're snowboarding? Do you need it professionally? So Orion had this note, one of many counterpoints to AR was being the only way to digitally augment the world, which is dynamicland.org. So Brett Victor works with Alan Kay to make this thing called Dynamic Land. Dynamic Land, I thought, and I visited there a lot, is this amazing system where you have little webcams, little low resolution webcams, and then you can use a laser pointer against a wall, and that projected interface and the laser pointer allow you to project your computing environment into your world and do all sorts of really interesting things. And I think the reason why that hasn't been taken up is, first, there aren't a lot of competitors for it. So venture capitalists said, well, there isn't a market, there's not enough people competing. And second, how does this sell us more heads-up displays and more chips? You know, how does this benefit Qualcomm, Snapdragon, and like AMD, and because it just sells printers, because you want to print these little codes that that the webcams can read. And so this became this huge thing. So now Kelsey's getting us back in track. How does this relate to our work at BlockScience? So I was going through the animating purpose of BlockScience, and my initial thing was, I think we have the opportunity to create a really beautiful article that could kind of set the stage for why BlockScience is different. And I think the structure of this article could be like this, which is, you know, from the BlockScience perspective. What are we doing right now? Like, what are the projects we're working on? So to really make it tangible. And I'm saying that because in this paper, it's very, very tangible uses of, you know, this is the Olivetti Smart Badge. Why are we doing it? So what is important about doing things in the way that BlockScience is doing things? And to note, very importantly, here's something we could be doing, like everyone is doing this other thing. Here's something we could be doing as BlockScience, but we are not doing it that way. We are not doing that thing. Why are we not doing that thing? And I think this really gives an example, like, why is BlockScience different? And then how does it differ from how other people are doing it? So it's, you know, people do things this way right now, but we are not doing those things. Why are we not doing those things? We are doing them this way. And then connect it to some principles. It could be connecting it to these principles, or, you know, the animating purpose of BlockScience, which I have in this other paper here, which is ethical design and innovation. What does that mean? What project has BlockScience done recently that has really shown an example of what ethical design and innovation is? Diversity of perspective is very straightforward, because there are actually social scientists in this organization. Hooray! It's amazing. Just that is awesome. And then, you know, integrity and autonomy. What does that mean? What does that look like from the BlockScience perspective as an individual contributing in BlockScience, as someone working on a BlockScience project? What does that mean? And then how does that all go into a positive sum impact? Because I think, you know, this animating purpose paper is very similar in some respects, in that here BlockScience is an organization that doesn't necessarily think about a problem in the same way that everybody's thinking about it right now. It's taking a step back and saying, you know, there are some questions about why something's being done. There's an idea of sustainable engineering. There is an idea of resilience and safety and more traditional civil engineering methods built in. And I don't think that people have been introduced to this in a software development context. And if they have, I think the world could be a much better place and people could follow it. So making a pattern for how people could do this too could be amazing. Or if you can't, just have BlockScience work on it. Z.
So yeah, I want to jump in and sort of at least hazard answers at the question that you were posing about, you know, what we're doing and the similarities. So for starters, I sort of think of the automation technology is already kind of dangerous high tech. There's like no circumstance in which automating things isn't already in the dangerous category, like full stop. I know people like to make it all sexy and perfect, but closing loops blows stuff up. So then on top of that, we're talking about the introduction of automation technology into things that are fundamentally socially subjective, largely economics and governance. And so when you're applying automation technology in the realms of economics and governance, you're deploying subjective decision-making directly into the technical infrastructure that is facilitating human behavior. And thus, in the sense of ubiquitous computing, quite literally, we're doing, I think, the thing that he's talking about. It's just that the interfaces are harder to recognize because, again, collecting data, using it, making recommendations or decisions on our behalf, allocating our attention and money, exposing us to risks or insulating us against those risks are all of the ways in which the real world is sort of cyberspatial, right? It's happening in information processing, decision making, et cetera. And he already alludes to that a little bit with the tracking of people. And so there's actually a pretty tight illusion there. But then in terms of like, well, what are we doing? I mean, practically, I think a lot of the processes for, pragmatic public engagement and accountability have been some of the margins of like exploration, like the Gitcoin Sybil resistance work with Danilo and their team was a really compelling exploration of, okay, we're going to be doing this rulemaking, we're going to want human input, but we also need technical expertise and we have legitimacy challenges. And by the way, they expect it to be highly automated. There's also just like resolving what was effectively political crises that arose in the case of the Filecoin SDM CDM crisis is a strong word, but there were two different camps with different perspectives on subjective choices, and it required someone both very technically aware and very socially politically aware to be able to break apart the facts of the situation from the subjective opinions of the various participants in the ecosystem. A fairly great example, I think, from lately was that with the Aztec team engaging with us to help distill out requirements and ultimately make recommendations on sequencer selection algorithms, again, because there really wasn't a right and wrong answer. You just needed to find a way to understand what people felt was important and incorporate knowing what's important into mapping the design space and then saying, well, from what we gather matters more than the other thing. Here's what we think makes sense for you guys, but also it's a recommendation in a more of a traditional engineering way. And so I think we do have examples. And just to kind of reiterate, I think a big part of what I want to accomplish with BlockScience today is taking this beyond the scope of any particular automation technology, say blockchains or even the LLMs and the AI stuff. I mean, we're hearing all this inflammatory narrative around AI as well at the moment, and just like ground it in real problems, engineering methodology, contextual solutions that account for the social and subjective elements. And the last bit on that is I see it's really important to have both the sort of technologist engineer, the technology expert engineers, and the kind of social scientist, anthropologist, et cetera, and the public engagement. But keeping in mind that the ability for an individual like to think about the big picture is often bounded. They think about their own experience, and they're effectively the ground truth about their experience of the system is them. But then you also have people whose job is to reason about these things systematically and the sort of society, culture, user group level, social science of the system and the technical science of the system, and kind of bringing those together in such a way that we don't go off into techno solutionism, but we don't also run off into trying to create things that actually don't make sense just because the public says they want them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like there's almost like a different setting that people could have, because I think there's almost a one-dimensional cartoon understanding of what technology and automation is from the general public, which is most people don't have experience of being in a factory that makes a dangerous substrate and being able to identify and stop what's going on. Or any of the, there's almost this gap, and I keep thinking about this, like that there's this gap between people, working with, their parents in a kitchen or, in a garage, working on things at a more, I hate to say atomic level, but like a more piece level, where they're actively doing mechanics, like the mechanical blue collar nature of things, even like, working in the service industry, where you must produce real life things at a certain deadline and they must come through. You almost have this like new white collar simulation system in which people don't have to repair things when they go bad. They just buy a new iPhone. And there isn't the idea of like maintaining, it's more like let's get Uber Eats and like hire a cleaner. Like there isn't like this idea of maintain, reduce entropy, and think about the consequences. So like very often when I interview with people, it's, how would you make a system that's more, and I love that word, metastable, like, your lungs are, you don't have to think about all the processes in your body. You are focused on doing what you're doing, and maybe you get hungry and then you have to feed yourself, but you have this extra amount of time that you can come up with different situations. And I think it's really, really important to get into a notion of like, how do we actually make, what does a self-maintaining system look like? Or what is a system, I would say not necessarily self-maintaining because that's a little utopian, but one that requires the least amount of maintenance, or is very easy to maintain, or is a joy to maintain. Like, what does that look like? And because otherwise we get into these systems where it's a complete pain in the neck, and you have programmers programming a certain language, not leaving behind a lot of reasonable information, and then the next person has to deal with it. We see this in electricians all the time too. It's like somebody opens up the wall, a new electrician's like, oh, I hate how the wiring was done in this wall. So it's not like a new problem, but it seems like it shouldn't be a discontinuous thing of like white collar and blue collar. They should be informed by each other. And I think it's a real shame that we think it's separate and that people don't have those same skills. Z?
Yeah, so I was going to tie in the question of the, appreciating, even enjoying the maintenance to the question of governance and attention, because it's also come up frequently that people are trying to automate away certain kinds of governance decision making because we view it as a cost. And partly that's because we're so bombarded with things that consume all of our attention, and we're near our attention limits. And so we don't have free available attention. And so it's difficult for us to even imagine enjoying something that costs our attention, but that, insofar as we want to have like healthier relationships to systems that we're governing, it may also be important to view that governance as maintenance and of institutions at the very least, in the technologies that those institutions govern in part, that maintaining, tuning, caring, paying attention, becoming informed, discussing, I view that, at least in this discourse, as kind of maintenance and care work, which in turn, we want to be in a place where we value it, but not necessarily transactionally value it, to some extent where we can enjoy and appreciate it.
Yeah, and I feel like, I made a little joke in the chat about like, how do you make governance fun, right? It's like most people don't want to talk about governance, and they don't want to think about governance, and most people don't want to brush their teeth. But when you're a kid, there were like little songs and stuff and like little rituals. You're like, and now you brush your teeth, and now you just have to do it, right? And this like daily entropy abatement process happens. And that's part of like, is it part of the governance of yourself to like reduce the entropy system happening in your mouth every morning? And if you forget it, you have to deal with these deleterious effects. Like that's a very long-term time process that we have to get engaged with, and people wouldn't normally maybe do that. In other cultures, you could say, what are the cultures in which people have great teeth health and don't brush their teeth? How is it different from us? Like there's all sorts of different questions that you could come up with for that. And so in general, there's either the thing should be seamless and that it should be passed through, and it doesn't have to be beautiful, it just has to be functional. But if that functional interface keeps changing all the time, like Facebook changing shape, it becomes very difficult to, like on Facebook, you have governance happening by a like every time someone likes something, that is a vote. And so it's constant governance. Governance has been monetized. Governance has been made addicting. So people sit there for 30% of their day voting on different social media platforms. And they figured it out really well, but that's like a bad form of voting governance, or TikTok is the most extreme example. So how can, it's almost like if I see these new apartment buildings where it's almost like people are living a 2.5 dimensional life, like they don't get to see the real texture, they don't get to experience real light, they don't get to experience real colors, they don't get to experience real floors. How are they going to come up with interesting thoughts? How are they going to see the passage of time? How are they going to have these rituals in their life? And then I also see people really excited about life extension who, in my opinion, this sounds snarky, but who, in my opinion, haven't really lived yet. And that's why they're holding so stubbornly onto life. Like, what about, you go to Spain and you're eating food and you're really living the human form of life. What parts should be automated and what shouldn't? A lot of people that I've met who are farmers or, who are making food, they don't want that part automated. They don't, they actually want to have, but they want to have electricity in the background so that, they can use the appliances. So in a way, that early 1930s form of automation worked out pretty well. But this new form of automation is almost like we're the ones as humans doing the automated clicking. We're the automatons versus us working alongside automations and steering them, which is why I think, like in cybernetics, that the idea of steering should come back alongside an analogy of automation, instead of things are automated for us, we can't see them and we can't interrogate them and we can't change what they do because we can't see them and we have no power over them, versus being in a car full of metastable systems that you're steering to go where you want to go. And in a car, it takes many years to learn how to drive. It's a social thing to do. And I think that's a completely different system that it still has automated parts. But if we started thinking about things like that, how would we build objects from that approach? And I think a lot of times coming up with like a different set of approaches and how we might conceive of things could result in like very different technology solutions, but we're almost not looking at it far back enough. And so we keep, many people, not necessarily BlockScience, but we keep making the same thing again and again, expecting it to work. And so I'll get off the soapbox now.
So I'd like to hear from some other people, Danilo, maybe Heather. Heather helped a lot with the development of our values and mission as well. And I asked her specifically to come because I was hoping she would have thoughts about this.
I'm not going to have any like impromptu thoughts right now. I've just mostly been listening, and I have the piece open that, Zargham also told me about this a few minutes before the start of the call, so I haven't had a chance to read and fully digest, but I'm really enjoying the conversation. So thank you for having me.
Totally. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I wanted you to know I'm here and I'm listening, and I'm really enjoying this discussion. So
one of my favorite things is I have a mentor who's like 82 who ghost wrote most of the speeches for Gordon Moore and also a lot of Xerox PARC people who worked on Calm Tech. He ghost wrote the speech for Gordon Moore that became Moore's Law. And he'll say something to me and 10 years later I'll understand what he said. So I feel like, since I first started reading these papers, they're like little Taoist cones or something. Like, it's just, every time I read them, there's like, I try to read them every little time. Like, oh, there's just this little new thing that I didn't notice. It's like one sentence you could think about for like several months. So, I don't know if I'm ever going to really fully digest, the late Mark Weiser's mind and how he approached things, because he died when he was 46, right before he was going to write a book on Calm Tech. So since I knew that he existed, I was like, there's no one around to be a Mark Weiser. This is really frustrating, and then waited for more people to be a Mark Weiser, and then no one, and I could say, if at best I might be at 5% of a Mark Weiser, but if that's the case, there needs to be a 5% of a Mark Weiser in the world. And that's very, very important. So I'm putting some papers in the column, but maybe I can show you like one more that I really like. Also, his papers were disappearing from the web, which was making me really panicky. So I started to archive the papers. I like the designing calm technology one is really good, and the world is not a desktop one. I loved that the world is not a desktop because he noticed that when people were trying to make mobile technology in '94, that they were designing it as if people could put all of their attention on it. And now we basically have little desktop computers that take up all of our attention in our hands versus if we design technology to be in our worlds with us, how we could have had a world that wasn't necessarily a bunch of little glowing rectangles that we hang out with on a train. And so all of these are very perennial articles in that I think we could read them in 20 years from now or 20 years in the past, and it would still be the same. And there are very few people that I've ever met that, well, I didn't get to meet him, but the idea of writing about the universal, how can you write about tech that never changes? And you have to think about tech not as the new, but more as the same thing no matter what. It doesn't change. The surface area might change, how we use it might change, the affordances might change, but fundamentally it's always the same. And so when I read these, I try to think in that respect. Like, these can be perennial forever, and we can follow them from like a blue collar, white collar perspective. I wish we had a different collar. It was like collarless, collarless perspective. Like, we aren't wearing collars anymore, unless you're in politics.
T-shirt.
Yeah, on that topic of the world is not a desktop, I think that there is a tension that we get time from time and DAOs and so on, but I think it's a fundamental tension with tech in general, which is, I mean, how do you manage the cognitive cost, the attention cost of engaging with tech? And there is always a dilemma because on one hand, there is a way to minimize side effects, minimize the fact that tech could be not participatory by simply making sure that everyone spends time with the tech. And we see that a lot on DAOs, like, for example, we did see a lot that on Gitcoin, where it was expected to have involvement of everyone with everything. And one thing that keeps appearing time from time on the technology history in general is that one way of managing the attention costs is, rather than forcing everyone to spend time with the tech, you have a selection of experts, you have a subset of people whose goal is to engage with the tech. And because their goal is to engage with the tech, and they are able to manage their attention in a way that allows to use that attention effectively, so to spare others from engaging that tech. But there is the risk that once you exclude others from engaging with the tech, you run into the risk of tech being non-participatory, or that the expert starts to leverage that tech for his own benefit rather than the benefit of others. And I think that a lot of our mission with BlockScience is, how can we find a middle ground where we do have, let's say, where we can make tech participatory, but at the same time, we do not want to force everyone to be all the time engaged with the tech, so that you can have, for example, expert forum that is able to leverage that tech in benefit of others, but does not turn into an autocracy. Like, and yeah, so those are some thoughts that I did have while reading the article, and I think that resonates because I think that BlockScience is trying to find this middle ground, like, yeah, just throwing some elements in there.
Nice, thank you. I wonder if there isn't a middle ground.
I think there's a key comment that you made at the very beginning of this, and that's the recognition that whatever he did, it's going to be wrong. I think from that perspective, you know, a lot of what we're talking about sort of fits. You know, are we in a world that has been engineered to be terrible, or are we just are people in this world doing the best they can with what they have? And you know, is that what technology does? Is it sort of, it comes along as needed to sort of improve the what's possible. You know, one of the things I've thought about is, we've done a whole lot of, that's benefited the automation and in that making efficient production and operation of productive things. But if you want to govern them, it's still, you need a bunch of people to get together and like converse amongst each other and do things the old-fashioned way of hammering out a decision. Can something as as automatable as a social network be governed that way? Or is there a technology that needs to be developed that enables governance of it?
Or is it a better process in the before time so that there are less chaotic governance decisions that need to happen in a stuffy room with no ventilation, at 3 p.m.
But the before time is the time where you're going to get it wrong.
I feel like I was just thinking if we go back to a concrete example about the Facebook groups, how and Facebook was trying to buy an old startup of mine, and so we had a big discussion where they sat me in a stuffy room and they asked, how would you deal with this situation? And I was like, wow, you want me to make this decision really fast? They said, yeah. I said, well, first off, I would consider not just arbitrarily, I would consider more of like what has worked in the past already with governance decisions, which was, forum software allows the user themselves to do the governance of saying whether they want to publish, whether they're part of a specific group or whether they want to hide it. This was already written in. And so you have hidden stuff and you have private stuff and you have stuff that's okay with your friends or rather people at your same level. So if you're the admin level or you're the subscriber level or you're, Mercat level or whatever thing you get assigned to, you can see it within that shape. And so if you were on Facebook and you were in the shape of the group of your friends between 15 and 17 years old, nothing that you subscribe to within that band would be published outside of that band, and that would be okay, and that could have been built in, which is a big issue where I said, well, you made that whole move fast and break things where you've got a billion people that you're breaking some of their lives every time you do it, isn't necessarily ethical, right? But if they had a more reasonable design, it wouldn't be, let's just do this new, here's a new thing. It's like, that's not a new problem that you're trying to solve. If you had enough understanding of how this had been solved before at smaller groups, there would be a continuum of what to do instead of trying to reinvent it for a new system. I did not have that kind of answer because they really put me on the spot and said, you need to solve it immediately. And I'm like, well, if you built it that fast, then, you're going to have a problem that you have to solve immediately poorly again, and so I think there's this idea of I'm trying to get a logo design for the Calm Tech. And I really wanted to find some 90-year-old that would take a compass and ruler and design a physical logo on paper, understanding what that meant and how that felt to the mind. And it is very hard to find someone that designs logos like that. Yet the people that design logos that way have enduring 90-year-old logos, because they had to really think about it. And yeah, maybe you paid a lot more and maybe they chain smoked while they did it, an ad agency, and there are all sorts of ethics around, how they treated people. On the other hand, there was an idea of thinking about it so long and really internalizing it so that when you did create it after that back and forth feedback loop with the client, you could make something that was symbolic of something that you could put an entire industry's ideology into that could last for a long time. And I think that's the thing that bugs me about all these like arbitrary projects and logos is that they don't last so long because people didn't think about them that long. And so we're often floating around. You see this with startup people all the time. They're so obsessed with their idea and they can't let it go, and it's crazy, and they put their life savings into it and they divorce, over it. And the thing actually isn't something that people need, and they have not any process for determining that up front. And they are left with this diluted pieces of their life at the end, and they still can't introspect what went wrong. It's almost like people don't have good sensing, they don't have good diagnostics, they don't have any good visualization, and they don't have the ability to zoom out, make a plot of land analysis of what this thing is, and then ask good questions. And I think, I hang out with both artists and technologists. When I hang out with artists, I go by a different name and I act differently, because the joke with them is that one of my favorite artists, who's also a web developer, but he's also a classically trained painter from Glasgow, says the artists ask questions and technologists are often very declarative. They will tell you the thing. So you have to tell a computer a thing, right? You have to be very declarative. He said the artists ask questions, and if you can get a creative technologist, our friend Isaac, you get somebody that can figure the question and then make something that's available to people. And so if we can, at both sides, help artists have more tools and automations to do a thing, and also have it help technologists ask better questions, we could save billions of dollars and a lot of heartache on what we're building, and save that for companies too, who just can't seem to do that. And then that is the biggest pain that I see in modern life right now, is that there's such a lack of care put into many objects, and a lack of patience and a lack of slowness, that those objects end up being short-lived. And people say, oh, I don't have the time. It's actually, you do. But you offload that badness and incompatibility with the general public onto people when you don't think through, and they end up having, I think this article came out, it's like people's lives are now 30% made up of configuring technology, not using it, just configuring it. Whereas when you get into a car, you might configure things a little bit. The whole point is you get used to where the things are and you just drive, and things are there. So it's all, I feel like we could have, can we find some 90-year-old mechanics that we can interview, and how do you maintain an airplane and all these things, and try to get some of that knowledge out before it's gone, because I do feel like there is a loss of approach and process and understanding on the beginning side, that lends us to these terrible consequences on the outside, in which we've gotten used to the idea that most tech is totally mediocre. And I think that's kind of mild dystopia. Ryan says, yeah, okay.
I was gonna say, not just mediocre. I think this goes to a lot of your work. It's in service of someone other than the user, right? Whether it's taking your time with the configuration, or whether it's just the routing algorithms based on your votes in the Facebook, TikTok example, these policy systems behind the scenes that process that information and determine what you see and who makes money and yada yada. They just, you could argue that they're just not in service of the end user, and maybe they're adjacent to that. Maybe there's a version of them that balances between the needs of the organizations that produce and maintain those infrastructures, because it's certainly not free. It does have to have a way to sustain itself and pay the people who run the servers and all the yada yadas, but then not having it be only that, and kind of striking that balance. So I know that's a little bit rambly, but I think there's it's not just mediocre, it's just sometimes it's just in service of someone else, and or certain actors aren't fully taken into account when those things are designed and or governed.
Definitely. I feel like also, maybe this will be the last point since we're running over time. Dieter Rams, if you don't know about Dieter Rams is really interesting. Did this thing called industrial minimalism, and the whole point of industrial minimalism was it's just the design that you need and not more than that design. Very German. Here's the person. He worked for Braun, and so if you look at all of these, they look very familiar. Why do they look so familiar? So when we look at a lot of the kind of computer, or Apple. You actually see that this industrial minimalism that's where we get a lot of the basic Apple phone apps. It was because of someone who was an industrial designer who thought very deeply about how to build something. And then this became, the dominant user interface for Apple phones. So like, when we think about, Apple's like, oh, it's so minimal. It's like, well, it's a lot of the stuff is DRAMs. But we don't necessarily have that many industrial designers. Johnny Ive is one, but we don't have that many really making that transition to digital. Like, what would it look like to have digital minimalism? And in that case, we don't have any Dieter Rams anymore, and we don't have any Mark Weisers, and we don't have any Steve Jobs to adapt to find these weird designers and adapt them to this new interface. But we also don't ask questions like that. And I think if we did, and we had more people, joining this process, we could do something really great. From RISD, some of the people at RISD making Figma, which is an incredible design tool, they spent 3 years working in WebAssembly to make it so that people all over the world could have really, really small amounts of time to actually do, multiplayer design. And they spent the longest time saying, this is the problem that prevents us from doing multiplayer design tools. It's not the interface, it's the speed. So let's work on that, and then we'll build our design system around that. And then they got bought by Adobe. But there are very few people who say, here is the issue. Dyson does this too with a hairdryer. The issue was the sound. Let's spend 3 to 5 years figuring out how to reduce the sound, and so it's kind of a different set of approaches. But I think if you want to make a step change in the industry, that is one way to do it. And Z?
Yeah, so I think this might be more or less my closing contribution, so that we can move on to post discussions, and people who need to go can go. But just recognizing that, earlier we talked about the world is not a desktop. We wouldn't necessarily need to interact through screens. So you just have to remember that the interface isn't a screen necessarily. And sometimes it's a screen, but sometimes it's a sensor. Sometimes it's your Fitbit measuring your heartbeat. Sometimes it's the data that's collected from any other activity that you're doing. And so when we're reasoning about, whether it's ubiquitous computing and our interactions with all of these computational systems, whether it's our, quote unquote governance behaviors, our quote unquote economic behaviors, whether it's our interactions with screens, all of these are just ways in which information moves from us to other systems, and from other systems to us. And so I really do think of this as information systems, information architecture problems, and that those information architecture problems are themselves in this category of dangerous technologies because of things like privacy, because of the runaway effects of automation, from the effects of things that have viral dynamics fundamentally altering human behavior and then resulting in real social changes that might not be desirable, and so on. So if we come all the way back to kind of ground zero as dangerous technologies and how do we engineer them, I think basically any automation technology, particular in automation technology directly affecting human behavior, is class dangerous, and B, understanding it and appreciating it requires a much more systems civil engineering approach. And I'm at least kind of trying to push our team to take all of these different inputs, whether it's from the anthropological perspective, or whether it's from traditional engineering, or whether it's building expertise in emerging technologies smart contracts and LLMs, and make sure that we're pooling that knowledge together and using it to try to accomplish outcomes that hopefully will make a better lived experience for people. That's my feeling, and honestly, just thank you so much, Case, for coming and kind of helping us think through that and how it fits into the past, because we're not making it for the first time. We're recovering it, understanding it, learning how to do it, not inventing it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Case. Thanks everyone for joining. Feel free to stick around if you want to chat more or hang out. That might not necessarily be with Case though, because she might not want to say. But that was, yeah, super interesting, super thought provoking, and hopefully we can continue in the chat as well in Slack. Bye.
Looks like we're just gonna wrap this out. Casey, you had mentioned before about recording. We did record, I think possibly with slight editing, depending on people's preferences. It seems like it might be a good thing to try to, like, I don't know whether it's put it on YouTube, but or like if we have to edit it more to do that, obviously cut this conversation out. But I was gesturing at Jess to maybe support getting consents from everybody and just generally making sure that people are cool with it. And if we have to kind of redact anything, we do. But we could put the links to the papers in the the text part below it. And I don't know. I mean, I personally think that this goes beyond just like us learning to do this, but also kind of trying to set a standard and say like, hey, these things are important. We should be thinking about it. And we, don't aspire to be a giant company that does everybody's work. We actually just want to be part of an industry that works in this way. I might be talking to myself.
No, I think we're here. Well, I'm here.
I'm here, although I might help packing.
I'm here.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm gonna hop off too in a second, but I just wanted to broach the topic of the use of the recording before we all split.
Yeah, I think it's fun to have recordings. Be even more fun to have some documents. It's so hard to be clear. Like a very clear essay like these. It's like, I learned that Weiser would create just one of these little essays and then just be invited to speak for like a year. It's like, in the same way, we think of another real clear person would be, Marshall McLuhan was very clear, which is there's wit and compression, and then there's the depth that comes from, and there's that originality that you can't replace with an LLM, but how that changed how people thought about media, and that part of that was the role that people were trained up to do, or at least there was room for in the past, of a public intellectual. And in my opinion, public intellectuals there is still that role, but people aren't actually filling it. So and people end up saying so much more than they need because they're unclear and they're trying to get at it. So it's like, where do you get trained to be concise? That's a design process for your words.
I have I have like total thought leader PTSD, where like I can't make something simple because once it gets too simple, it reads too much like things I've read that are bullshit. And I have this like constant perma repulsion from anything that is, even if it would be like, I mean, I'm trying and I'm learning, in case among others have been helping, but like this is a very real challenge in an environment that's so populated with truthy that by the time you've done the hard work though to get to the understanding, to write the simple and concise thing, when you start to write it and it just looks and feels at first blush like things that are bullshit, even though it's not bullshit, the fact that the larger audience probably won't be able to see the difference in the labor that went into knowing the thing that you're saying is like a constant struggle for me personally. And so I don't know, I mean, if you have you've given me advice on this before, but I just wanted to comment on it because we've got several people from like our team at BlockScience who also push me to be concise. And
it's not necessarily it's just about like saying it how it is. It's just really hard to do, right? It's what I like about Weiser's papers, which is why I print them out and read them, not read them on a screen, is every sentence has meaning. It's fairly short. They are pretty dense for what they are, but they're short, but they're clear, and they speak in plain English. It doesn't look, the people who want to read it are going to read it. Not everyone's going to want to read it. But it says what it says about a complex subject and you get in and you get out and it's cool, but there's like a little humor in it. Like, and that humor more than anything gets you to really digest what the meaning is. I think the other thing that's really, really important is, you know, when I had that kind of critique on like, how could BlockScience make a really good article about this? It's like very concrete thing. What are we doing right now? What's one example? Why is it being done this way? Why does BlockScience do stuff differently than other people? Here's an example of something that we could have done this way, that most people do this way, but we did it this way. Why? And what's the outcome? And how did that differ from the traditional outcome that we see people experiencing? And how was that? You didn't even have to say that it's better or worse, but by presenting people something that they haven't seen before, which is a different kind of outcome or a different kind of approach, you're almost giving people a higher resolution experience of the world than the one that they autocomplete to. And I think right now people autocomplete to supernormal stimuli of what's possible. And by that I say, like, it's either this exciting thing or nothing, right? And it's not like putting data points in of like, oh, you could have a 0.5, you could have a 0.25, or like this thing could happen. There's going to be two responses. One is there's going to be copycat firms that say, cool, we're just going to follow this one process. And then you have to say, no. The process is different per company, but we have a process that allows us to identify what we need to do for a company. It's not perfect, and we go back and forth, but it's a greater level of depth. And I just don't think that people have that when they copy things cargo cult style. And so I think there's a big opportunity to show, not necessarily tell, and allow people to extrapolate from that. And I think that could be one step towards clarity.
Here's the rallying cry for new old engineering. Because we give a shit. I can see it on buttons.
That's great. New old engineering. Because we give a shit.
And it's almost like the idiocracy. Like, it's almost like you have to dumb down things so much to a level sometimes, because that's just, I don't know, the reduction of the simplest common denominator. Anyway, because we give a shit, I'll make some buttons for us for the next Cyborg on conference. I've been reading this book actually by it's called Greenpeace, The Insider's Story, by Rex Weiler, who we got to meet when we were out in BC at this little bookstore that we love on Cortez Island, where Paul Stamets and also, what's his name? The other mushroom dude lives there. Anyway, and it's Greenpeace, like warts and all, a 600-page book, and it's an incredible book so far. I'm only like 150 pages in right now. He's going over the context of like pacifism and nuclear disarmament activism, and he's weaving together like the historical context and then all these individuals who came together for Greenpeace. And it's just, the story is so brilliant and so many layers. But I'm really curious, because how did an organization like that, which had its roots in the 60s and is still incredibly like functioning today, these like different phases that it went through, they all were journalists, so they were incredibly media savvy, so they were able to really gain political traction. But I do think the climate now is a little bit different, because it feels more fascist in a lot of regard, or like civil disobedience. There's like playbooks on how militarized police can counter peaceful civil disobedience. But anyway, I highly recommend the book, and it's got me. Yeah, I think what you said, Case, about like studying how things have been done in order to revive it, or what are the examples of things in the world that are working in the way that we might like in order to make maintenance great again. Or like, yeah. Anyway, thank you. This has been a very stimulating conversation. I love Marshall McLuhan. That was definitely one of my first thoughts when we started talking about all this, and it's come up synchronistically in a few conversations. As Hash mentioned, Marshall McLuhan came up the other day, and then we were talking with Inverter Network about how do we design for like paradigmatic shifts. And I know Art Brock also talks a lot about this. Like, if as Donella Meadow says, like if paradigm shift is the like most high leverage way for systems change? How do we design for paradigm shifts? Or what are the paradigm shifts that we want to see? And I don't know, just these
Then we ask better questions and figure out the right questions to ask. But then we just have a process, right? Like they're like, be a little bit more philosophical about like, why are we doing this thing? Who decided that this was the thing to do? But the issue is, it's not. There's two things. Like, if you do that, then you're questioning everything, which is bad. So it's more about, you have a problem that you've identified that's a good problem. Like being in Cambridge, England this summer was really helpful, because I learned how to think Cambridge style. We spent 4 weeks coming up with a good question for our paper. And then the paper was pretty easy to write. And then the paper ended up being good, versus spending all of the time, like people came in with bad questions, and the mentors were there to shit on your questions in a kind way until you had good research questions. And then from there, we were able to make original papers that could be the basis of, accordion style publication, which means like you could take the paper and make it a, pop tech article, and you could also make it into a dissertation. The sinew was there for that. And I thought that approach was lovely, because first off, it felt very relaxed, even though we were doing like way higher quality work. Like for me personally, I had not done work at that quality, and I hadn't had the time, but we were working on the question for so long that, it was just the process was completely different. And then you see like, oh, here are all these Nobel laureates that came out of Cambridge. How did you digest the information? Well, you go to the pub and drink. Like, what? It was a completely different, like fully immersive environment, and it was around constantly. You're around all this like old stonework. It doesn't seem necessarily like fancy or stuffy. It just seems mysterious and reverent. Like you are thinking in a like mysterious, childlike way, and you want to contribute, or you're constantly seeing time, so you can't just be like, wow, it's new. Like, hey, this stuff has existed for, since 1200. So what does that mean? Like, this stuff doesn't need to change, right? So there was always this, the environment was constantly kind of prodding you ambiently to do things better. And thanks, Hash. So I think that's one of the things I really took away from that experience, because I came back and I looked at my 50,000 pin Pinterest board, in which I was grasping at all sorts of things, right? Which would be like color, clothing, interior design, And I came back and I said, I've seen the origins for all of these things now. Not only have I seen them, I've experienced them. I haven't just gone to a museum. I've lived alongside them in a three-dimensional environment and seen how they worked. Now I can just delete most of the stuff, and I can come up with it from the beginning. And I think there was this extreme meaning to seeing the origin points of stuff, where I think this happens along a lot of things. Like, you want to get into drawing, and so instead of learning how to draw, you go online and you save a bunch of drawing tutorials, but you're not actually going somewhere with someone to help you develop a process for learning how to draw well over 3 years. And that's that huge difference between like truth and truthy, where you see a lot of people really wanting the truth, and they end up hoarding, and that's bad. And then you see them doing that with everything, and then you see a designer that like adds too much instead of takes it away. They don't know how to edit, and they've only gotten one part of the process. They haven't gotten the other part. And so we talk about having the idea of having a really good question is, you need to have a problem, and you need to figure out what the problem is, and the question is associated with that. And that's why I think a lot of this innovation has been done at these companies that experience big issues, like noise in a telephone line, with Claude Shannon, that they had big problems, and so you could have interesting people work on solutions. And so without that, people can run, there's so many eddies that people can get stuck into. And I think right now we're more eddies than actual rivers. as a human populace. And that's really disappointing to me, because man, is it annoying for me personally, who's gotten stuck in eddies for years, to get into to kind of make a river. It doesn't look like anything to begin with, and you have to make that gravity. And so yeah, it sucks, but I think there's an opportunity, because this is, I think, doing things a little bit different is probably the only way forward. Here's my OG Apple hat. Yeah. But
The conversation reminded me of something I just like have to tell you while it's popping my head about digital hoarding and like the deleting things and like getting flow. When I was working with Orion on thinking through some of the KMS stuff and then working with Jamshid in person last week, we realized that GDS allows us to argue for the necessity of forgetfulness directly. That like if you have a stream of data that your system is observing and like you're creating new records to represent your observations, that's already effectively diverging, it's accumulating. On top of that, if you do processing that results in new insights or new records, new statements that you've learned, now you're accelerating because you're observing. And so like exogenously observing, then you're endogenously compounding your observations into new internal observations. So you have an accelerating runaway process. So without a process to also recognize and effectively drop things as a function of their like sort of non-future utility of some kind, or a way of reasoning about the fact that you've either had enough insights leveled up derived from it or otherwise compressed it that you can drop stuff, that generalized dynamical system goes unstable, and thus make you just like the hoarding, the accumulation is an overflow, always an overflow. Like just the basic concepts in engineering on stability, that's an unstable system. So you have to be able to not just choose what to observe so that you're observing streams and develop processes for deriving insights from the observations, which creates more. You actually also have to have the forgetting mechanic or your system always blows up. And so like forgetting as necessary component in learning, not just an unfortunate side effect of having too much stuff, but actually if you don't have it, your system is canonically unimplementable. Like it's unsustainable.
Yeah. Two threads. Yeah. Sorry, I was just gonna say 2 threads on that is like discomfort with death is a thing. And also in the consciousness realm of like why do like the inertia of it all sometimes puts us to sleep versus when you actually, for example, do a big dose of psychedelics or something and it rewires your brain, or it like defragments your brain. It's the forgetting. It's like waking up as every day is new again. So I think that makes sense with other contexts as well, as far as like processing or some sort of cognition. And yeah, I don't know, I think it feels really important. And even I was reading Kelsey's AI paper yesterday too, and it came up in the part where she's talking about when you guys were realizing that there needs to be like some sort of external information feed to check against as well. Yeah, just it feels important in not getting stuck in eddies or in these systems to be able to see, to slowly, even if there's inertia, like see outside of the feed, like so that the feedback loop doesn't get so stuck, I guess.
Yeah, or every once in a while being like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
But you have to know when to ask it, right? So it's never one size fits all.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm really interested in what you said, Case, about the getting like the difference between the saving tabs and actually going somewhere to have like a long-term study of a thing or develop something over time. I'm gonna sit with that. And just like I'm more interested maybe in another conversation to ask you more deeply about how you saw the like through the pattern or to be like seed or the origin that spun off everything else.
I just feel
Sounds like an interesting,
pretty
crazy
deeply,
exploration.
so it's mostly how I feel. Then
Yeah.
it's
It's
like, oh, I'm
sometimes hard
here.
to explain, but yeah,
Right.
I'm
It's like, but it was a fully intact cultural experience. It wasn't a two-dimensional representation of it like we get in the United States about like Japan or England, It wasn't,
yeah.
there's a double-decker bus and a fake English accent that's like a bad version of Mid-Atlantic. No, it was a real thing. Where on the outside, it looked formal and stuffy because, wow, we have to dress up in formal wear every Friday to go into a candlelit dinner hall that doesn't have electricity, where we're hearing a Latin like chant beforehand. What? But then you're there and you're like, aha, I see why this thing is here. And there's a meaning to it, and it doesn't feel stuffy. You're dressing up to party. It's fun. It's like a wedding that you get to have every Friday. And so that's the issue is like it's really easy to tell these two-dimensional stories about stuff. Like, for instance, in Japan, a tea ceremony is formal and sober and serious. No, it's goofy, and so I think that's I don't know where we get these ideas.
Mm,
But once they become heavy set and stereotypical, we often keep the judgment and we don't go back to the origin and ask.
mm,
So, Alon it was really great to have Alon and Natalia be like, we have to take you to Yale and before you go to Cambridge, because Yale is based on Cambridge. What? So I went and I was like, oh, what? There's a place like this. And then I went to the origin point and I was like, there's a origin point of this place, right? And so I think that's the most important thing is like, can you go to the origin? So someone asked me to give a talk on cybernetics, and I was told by an old friend, like, why don't we go on the connectedpapers.com and find the things that reference the things that, find the origin paper, and there's this paper from 1956 that was a hilarious overview of what cybernetics could be. And I read that paper out to a room of people on laptops. Everyone put their laptops away. We had a story time. We were on the same page. And it was really lovely because people could consider from that origin point of cybernetics in this kind of snarky, interesting way and really introspect in a way that we couldn't just by reading a normal text. And I think that, yeah, we don't have story time. We definitely
Can
don't have someone reading
Can we
for us.
have that? Wait, can we just have like once a month story time with Case and like
yeah.
we'll just like let you read us something, have a discussion, stick it on YouTube and get like followers who actually think that
Interested.
thinking is a thing you should do.
I thought you were gonna say you went and visited Stafford Beer's grave or like Norbert Wiener's grave or something. When you're talking about going to the source, I've had some similar experiences like in India, and also I went to the Allman Brothers grave because my boyfriend in college was obsessed with the Allman Brothers, and after listening to their music and then seeing like the music they chose for their tombstone, yeah, I like this point about it's like a pilgrimage, yeah, it's kind of journeying to the source.
That's why I'm reading all these Robert Caro books. He's this journalist that writes these enormous biographies of people. He doesn't just write a biography about the person, this and this happened. He's like, okay, I'm going to write about Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm going to spend like 2 years in hilltop country in Texas and experience what it feels like to be there.
Mm.
And then understand how that plus the genetics of the person plus, how the people interact with each other in the town creates someone with an extreme need for power and a super weird shape,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, well, the knowledge transfer is interesting how we think about it nowadays versus I read a translation of one of, was it the Vedas, I don't know, in Vedantic or Jnana yoga, it's like the yoga of the intellect. There's a bunch of text on like how knowledge is transferred, and I got read a few pages of a translation, and it was fascinating because yeah, they're talking, I really think that you can go, if you go to the origin of a place, it's almost like, yeah, some kind of a download, or when you are with certain beings, or so I feel like you going to Cambridge or like seeing the second order like copy of it at Yale and then going to the source and experiencing those rituals. Yeah, the embodiment aspect is really powerful. Or like it just, I don't know, it transmutes information because you're getting it in the sensory levels close up. even though some yogis say you could access it, like, well, once you've accessed this dimension, you can actually access it at any time, because in your body the imprint is there that you can then like imagine being there again and maybe nearly register the same experience, like brain or nervous system wise.